We actually have to do this, don't we? Yay! Ugh. Well, we're 5 episodes into Doctor Who Series 11 and we've got 5 left. We are officially halfway. As today we're going to be taking a look at Doctor Who Series 11 episode 5, which is of course the Tsuranga Conundrum, written by the brand new head writer Chris Chibnall, once again of course featuring Jodie Whittaker as the 13th Doctor. And I think that so far when it's come to my Doctor Who Series 11 reviews, it has been a fairly entertaining series so far. I think that each individual episode has had something about it that has physically contributed to the series. It has been fairly enjoyable. I think quite a few of the episodes do have flaws here and there, which I have addressed in my reviews in the past. However, none of them have been 100% negative, or even sort of over 50% negative. I think if anything, for the most part, these reviews have been mildly positive. I think that most of the episodes have been more positive than negative, if anything, because each episode has sort of been quite creative in its ideas, and also it has had something interesting to contribute to the Doctor Who universe. Well, enough about them, as today we're going to be taking a look at the Tsuranga Conundrum, which is of course episode 5, and this episode throws all of that out of. No doubt if you are somebody who watches a lot of Doctor Who episode reviews, you may have seen a few more reviews already before this one of this story, and I think that it would be a fair presumption to state that this episode is probably one of the most negative of these series so far, and I'm going to get this out there immediately and say that this episode review isn't going to be an overly positive one, because I must admit this story is a little bit of a letdown. Each one has something about it which is just incredibly drained, incredibly dull. It did have potential to go some places, however the effort has just seemed to run dry, and that is something that is quite worrying considering that we're only 5 episodes into a brand new era of the show. And the most worrying part of this is the fact that it is actually written by the brand new head writer. I would kind of expect an episode of this quality to almost be in the 3rd season of the Moffat era, after he's already utilised quite a lot of his ideas in the previous seasons. However, this one, his first season, is already contributing a very unusual story, and one of which that doesn't particularly have too much going for it. Hey, enough about the negative stuff. We're going to in fact start this review on a little bit of a positive note, because I want to get all the positive things out the way first, because don't get me wrong, there is in fact a few aspects of this story that I did enjoy. There was quite a few laughs, there was a few sort of mildly emotional moments. As I say, nothing too special, but we will get onto that in a little bit. So taking a look at the production details for this story, as I was saying, unfortunately this episode is written by Chris Chibnall. All of the episodes so far have had a contribution by him, including the Mallory Blackman story, which was of course Rosa. I believe the majority of that episode was written by her. And the issue with having an opening season, and all the first 5 episodes of the series are written by the same person, you kind of have one person's ideas and one person's way to direct the series. And when we originally heard about Doctor Who Series 11, there was a lot of news about this writer's room idea, and so far we've not really seen any of that. So I think that one of the good things to actually take from this episode is the fact that this is the last Chris Chibnall story for, I do believe, until the series finale. The rest of the episodes this year have in fact been written by different people, so I am expecting the rest of this series to hopefully, fingers crossed, be of a higher, more consistent quality than the earlier half of this series. This episode is directed by Jennifer Perrott, which I think that some of the shots were nice for this story. The script editor is Fiona McAllister, which I do believe she has done a few of the previous episodes as well. Produced by Nikki Wilson, executive producers Chris Chibnall, Matt Stevens, and of course Sam Hoyle. As like normal, the incidental music is of course composed by Segan Akinola, and that is basically it for the production material for this story. Moving on to characters, we of course have the 13th Doctor, as portrayed by Jodie Whittaker. This time round she's wearing her pink shirt. That variation, we kind of have seen that I do believe twice now so far this series, and it must be said, I think that so far in this story, the 13th Doctor does have a few nice moments. I did particularly like the little speech that she had about kind of hope and trying to find hope. I thought that that was quite nice. I was very shocked to see this rather unusual version of the 13th Doctor that was in fact a little bit selfish. Of course she does in fact get attacked by the sonic bomb at the early half of the story, or whatever it was, and she was left a little bit hazed for the most part of the early act of the story, and she was a little bit just about herself and her friends, stories. She didn't particularly care about anybody else on the space station, which I like that because it made the Doctor feel almost a little bit unlikable, which is something that is certainly a different direction for Doctor Who recently. It's something a little bit more 12th Doctor-ish in its approach from the early half of his era. A bit odd and a bit unsettling, which I quite liked. And also I like the elements in this story that almost suggested that this Doctor is very much a fan of technology. Of course, she does see the antimatter device in this episode, and she's almost in awe about that. I like the idea of her being a rather big fanatic of technology in different sort of components and things like that. I think that that is kind of quite a nice character trait and almost like a mad professor. The different references to literature as well. Of course, we've had a few historical figures referenced already throughout Doctor Who Series 11. Of course, in this episode we did have a few references to Poirot, the detective, and also have a few references to Hamilton in there as well. Of course, I do believe the current theatre production that is going on in London at the minute and has got quite a lot of attention in the media. And I think that it's quite interesting to have a Doctor that's rather focused around literature and maybe historical figures. It will be very nice to see a bit more of that in the future. Moving on to the companions for this series, we have 3 of them as per usual, which I do think is one of the main suffering points for this story. To start off with, we have Bradley Walsh, who of course plays Graham O'Brien. Once again, a recurring theme from the previous episode reviews. He is my favourite companion so far this series. He is certainly the most likeable. He does have a few moments throughout this story that I did enjoy, such as the call midwife references. I like the fact that they return to the use of the word cockle that we used in Rosa. I'm really hoping that becomes a catchphrase. Something about Graham that is incredibly likeable. He's a really warm character. He has a very nice approach to Doctor Who stories and the way they are plummeted into different situations, and also the fact that he is almost on a new lease of life at the minute after having cancer previously a few years ago. It's nice to have almost this younger side of him coming out, and I think that if anything that relates to the companions in this story, one of the main elements that was good about this episode is it did offer a few bits of character development between Graham and Ryan. I actually felt like there was a bit of a bond throughout this story that they were able to kind of connect with, especially throughout the male pregnancy scenes in the later half of the episode. I did think that that was good, a very strong sort of moment, and I think that if anything is to be took from this story, it's possibly that character development there. Orson Cole as Ryan Sinclair, once again a little bit of a similar situation to the early half of Doctor Who Series 11, more in particular the Ghost Monument, where he was kind of just there as an observer in order to spout out a little bit of character piece information here and there. In this episode we did have a few references once again to his father, which did of course leave him very early on in his life. We did also have a little bit more information revealed about the death of his mother, which I think was the scene that was delivered in was just incredibly jarring. It was just essentially reading off questions. It felt like she had a piece of paper in front of her and she was saying, "When did she die? How old were you? How did it make you feel?" And it just felt like almost a very sad, boring interview. And that is what we got off this story development wise. It did feel incredibly jarring, it took away from the plot, and it almost paused the entire narrative in order to just have that scene. And I think that Tosin Cole did have a few nicer moments in this story that I did enjoy. I think that certainly he's the second most liked character from the companions, because he was sort of a character that you do like. I particularly dislike him. He certainly had a little bit more of importance in this story than Yaz did, which I will get onto in a second. But yeah, I just think that it would be nice to see him do a little bit more. Then we've got Yaz, played by Mandy Gill, which the previous review and the one of Rosa, I was in fact rather positive about Mandeep's character. I previously said in the other reviews that she's had a little bit of a flaw here and there, because in the early half of this season we kind of felt like you needed to like her character when you knew absolutely nothing about her. In this story, once again, I kind of feel like that she was a late contribution to the story, where she kind of just seeped into the background. She was the equivalent of just a chair in a corner. She didn't really have much to contribute. As I say, that scene with Ryan was essentially her just reading off questions, and it is really annoying. I've already seen a few glimpses earlier on this season that she does certainly have potential, and I'm just happy that in the previous stories, such as Rosa, and also in the previous episode where we met her family as well, we did get a bit of development there. And of course in the next story we do have her going back to see her older relatives as well, so that is going to be a story focused around her. So it is nice, but also at the same time time, it kind of feels like the episodes that aren't completely dedicated to her character, she slips behind, she fades into the background, and earlier on in this story, in the early half where they woke up from the sonic bomb scene, where I didn't even realise Yaz and Ryan were actually in the scene itself. There was a moment when I turned to my dad, who was watching this episode with me, and I actually asked him if Ryan was in the previous scene, and both of us didn't actually know. He just kind of seeped into the background, same with Yaz. They didn't really have much to do, and it's a shame. And moving on to the other minor characters for this episode, which, to be completely honest, are the equivalent of minor pieces of fluff, which just float around the scenery, not really doing much whatsoever. So the first character, Brett Goldstein as Astos. He's the character that is killed off in the earlier act of this story. Don't particularly know why. If anything, I actually think that he might have had potential if he wasn't killed off. It was nice that he was killed. It certainly made the alien feel more of a threat, even though we later found out that it wasn't really much of a threat whatsoever. Then we have Lois Chimiba, I do believe you pronounce it, as Mably, which I think that once again, she was likeable, she was okay. She have the two sort of professor characters for this story. You have Suzanne Packer as Eve Cesario, which I think that she was in Casualty, and from what I can recall, she was a very good character in Casualty, so it's a shame that once again we have a character that could have had potential. If anything, it would have been nice that maybe she was the captain of the ship, and had a few more moments with her to actually show her in the role as being a captain. But Ben Bailey Smith as Dirk Cesario, which is of course her brother, once again he was barely in any scenes whatsoever. I didn't really have much time to actually engage with his character, didn't particularly find him very interesting either. I kind of felt like I was meant to like him, but we didn't really have too much time to like him. David Shields as Ronan the android, which once again, I know he's an android and he's not meant to really possess much emotion, but I actually found that his usage in the story was once again irrelevant. He could have very easily been written out of the story. We have the final character, Jack Shallow as Yoss, who is the pregnant male character, which once again, his actual sort of thing in the story, if you want to call it a character, a development piece, a storyline, the fact that he's pregnant and all of that. I like the idea of the alien aspect of him and the fact that the females of his species give birth to females and the males give birth to males. That is very odd, very unusual, very sort of extraterrestrial. I thought that was quite intriguing. Didn't really have much to contribute to the actual story. If anything, I kind of felt like that part of the script was just there in order to distract Ryan and Graham and actually giving them something to do, because if it wasn't for that part of the script, they wouldn't have had anything to do whatsoever, and arguably we wouldn't have had that bonding scene either. His sort of presence in the story is certainly more detrimental to the other sort of characters in the story that don't really have much to do at all. Now the characters are out of the way, now taking a look at the plot and narrative for this story. Oh, where on earth do we start with this one? I honestly feel like somebody approached Chibnall very early on in the production of Series 11 and basically handed him the burden of this random odd CGI creature that he somehow needs to crowbar into an actual story. It feels like that the alien was created before the actual script was. It's a very odd episode because I kind of don't understand why it exists. It feels like an unfinished story that kind of has a lot more to be added to it. For a start, the characters are the equivalent of cardboard cutouts. I love the idea of the ambulance going through outer space. And I kind of feel like from the outset, this episode is almost very Big Finish box set in its approach. You've got an ambulance that is also a spaceship that is travelling around different galaxies, picking up people that have been injured, and then that episode turns into a base under siege where you've got this alien that is taking control and using the technology. That part of the episode sounds very Big Finish. As I say, very Big Finish box set, missed there to fill in a few spaces, giving a bit of character development. But this episode goes on to then have the pting in the story, which I've not actually mentioned that creature in the characters, because once again, for some reason, Series 11 has this habit of not actually having vocal aliens in the series. I don't know why. I was going to reference it in the Arachnids in the UK review, but I kind of like the spiders in that episode. They kind of didn't really have a need to speak because they were biologically advanced. But in this story, we have a random sort of creature that can't speak, can't interact, therefore you've got quite a lot of lacking development on that front because it can't physically introduce its character, and the bulk of the actual reasoning behind the character itself and saying what it is, what it does, what the actual threat is delivered via a computer, and within that minute that is it. That's all you learn about the actual character itself. In early stories we had the problem of racism. That's of course a villain to some extent, however once again not a vocal one. And then you have the Ghost Monument, which from what I can recall had the rag creatures, which did speak, however they were there for approximately about 2 minutes, and that was it. You don't really have much whatsoever. This series is incredibly lacking in actual monsters that speak and deliver their aims and deliver what they are doing. And I think that it is very odd to get to episode 5 in a series and actually have a lack in that, and I'm just hoping the future episodes do have actual villains that speak. Doesn't prove that the TARDIS team is strong enough in order to cope with a villain that doesn't even speak, and also at the same time the actual villain in the first place is incredibly laughable. It's pretty pathetic, and it just doesn't really get my attention whatsoever. A lot of people have been saying that the pting is cute looking, and yes, it is cute looking, but I worry that that is the sole purpose why this villain exists. Probably to cash in on merchandise. If we don't see pting merchandise at some point, I will be quite shocked. It's kind of the same element as the adipose. They were cute looking, they were small, you could very easily make an adipose into a plush and sell it to a lot of people. But the big difference between the pting and the adipose was the adipose weren't really much of a villain. They were just a creature that has been created by the actual villain. Adipose were created by somebody else in order to give children to the adult adipose on the birthing planet or whatever it was. They weren't strictly a villain, but the pting actually is, and that is the downfall of this story. The alien is pathetic, the scripting isn't very good, it's all talk and it doesn't do anything with it whatsoever, and also the development in this episode is incredibly crowbarred in, and once again doesn't really make an enticing listen or watch. Moving on to something that I did actually like about this story, and it looked visually very nice, not necessarily from the directing front but actually from the set design. I think that the set people and the costume designers did a very good job throughout the story. Of course, once again we have the talents of Ray Holman, who developed the 13th Doctor's costume. It did look very nice throughout this episode, but the actual space station itself from the set design perspective was very nice indeed. It looked very futuristic, and it's something of which that I would kind of expect to see in maybe Star Trek or in more higher production sort of Netflix science fiction series, because it looks like it's actually from a film. Considering that Doctor Who is essentially just a TV show that lasts an hour on BBC One on Sunday nights, I think that that is achieved not really very often. So yeah, a massive thumbs up to the production team for actually making this episode look very good. Also Segan Akinola, once again he did do a nice job throughout the story. I'm not really going to compliment him as much as I did in the previous reviews, because he has certainly done a lot of interesting music scores in the previous episodes for this series. This episode wasn't necessarily standout for him. I think it was so far more really ambient tones and atmospheric stuff, nothing really too dramatic or anything like that. One of the things that I have noticed when it came to Segan's music is he's incredibly talented with locational stuff. Of course we have the Ghost Monument, the music in that was incredibly standout. Rosa, the same for that. That was an incredibly nice story, very within that time period, and a lot of the music did reflect that era, as well as kind of the American theme in there as well. The previous story was rather contemporary to suit the setting of contemporary Sheffield. The same for The Woman Who Fell to Earth as well. There was a lot of contemporary music in that one. So yeah, this episode was a little bit of a back step for him, but I am expecting quite a lot in the next story, considering that once again we are on location in a historical setting, and to be honest I'm just holding out for that story, especially after this one. I think that it will be a fair comment to say every season of Doctor Who normally has a dud episode. Sometimes on more than one occasion it is more than one story, so if this story is the only dud of Doctor Who Series 11, then I'm happy. I am fine. I'm fine with this episode being the dud. I can just forget it exists. However, I'm worried that this theme is going to continue. I'm worried that one of the main components that is actually the reason for the downfall downfall this season is because of the actual TARDIS team itself. Not that the actual actors and actresses are bad or anything like that, it is because the quantity is too big. I don't think that this current writing team is handling the actual TARDIS team very well. I think that so far we are only seeing development within one character at a time. We had Ryan at the start of the series, then we had a bit with Graham, then we had a bit with Yaz, but we don't really have the same thing running all the way throughout. It kind of feels like if one story isn't completely dedicated to that character, then all the other characters slip to the back, when what we really need is character development between all three characters at the same time within one story, and not kind of taking turns, because otherwise you end up with situations like Yaz where literally we are on to episode 6 next week and I still don't really know much about her character. I worry that one of the main components that is actually the reason for the downfall this season is because of the actual TARDIS team itself. Not that the actual actors and actresses are bad or anything like that, it is because the quantity is too big. I don't think that this current writing team is handling the actual TARDIS team very well. I think that so far we are only seeing development within one character at a time. We had Ryan at the start of the series, then we had a bit with Graham, then we had a bit with Yaz, but we don't really have the same thing running all the way throughout. It kind of feels like if one story isn't completely dedicated to that character, then all the other characters slip to the back, when what we really need is character development between all three characters at the same time within one story, and not kind of taking turns, because otherwise you end up with situations like Yaz where literally we are on to episode 6 next week and I still don't really know much about her character. People have said when this episode aired that the main thing for this story and the main theme for Doctor Who Series 11 is to bring on that new audience, and I fully understand that and I fully respect it. I think that it is a great idea, especially after the 11th Doctor era. A lot of people got put off the show because they could no longer just tune into one episode a week and actually enjoy it, because you had countless plot threads being intertwined throughout the whole series, and it was kind of a similar thing for the 12th Doctor era, however on a slightly smaller scale. So far Doctor Who Series 11 has certainly been living up to that new viewer perspective, because it has been utilising the idea that the audience is new for quite a long time. It is introducing all of the characters again, it's slowly introducing the TARDIS back in, and it's saying about the Doctor and the context of her past very, very briefly. It's not really daunting the viewer or alienating them in order to bring back older characters or anything like that. I fully understand what people are saying when they say they want to do a science fiction story such as the Tsuranga Conundrum that is a little bit more slow, it's not too complex, not full of technobabble. But if anything, I actually think that this story has a lot of speaking. It just does a lot of it. Every single character is constantly talking. If it's about the actual narrative itself from the Doctor's perspective, or you've got Ryan and Yaz talking about the relationships in the past that they've had between, say, Ryan and his father, then you've got Graham saying about what he does in his spare time, then you've got the pilot character, a disorder or problem where she's developed pilot's heart, which is something that she can't let get out into the public eye because she wants to be looked upon by people, she wants to be seen as a hero and not somebody with a disorder. This episode has got so many different ideas going for it, and then you've got the pting on top of that as well, which is just this random creature that eats absolutely everything and gains energy, which really is quite a basic concept. It just, for some reason in this story, everything is spoke about 24/7, just a constant chat fest constantly. All 50 minutes are just people talking for no reason. The episode needs to be simple in order to engage to that new listener. Yes, some of the elements of this story are simple, but at the same time of being simple, they're also pretty dull and boring. I'm fairly confident in saying, if I've not seen Doctor Who before, and if this is my first season of the show that I've ever watched, or the first season that I've watched in a long time, then I will be put off by this story almost, because it just seems dull and doesn't have much going for it. It's not entertaining, and it doesn't utilise the amount of time either. Considering that this is 50 minutes, it could have done a whole lot more. Considering we only have 10 episodes this year, as opposed to 12, it feels like a waste of a story. It feels like almost the budget was running low, but the CGI was really nice. It's odd. I thought the visuals, as I've said already throughout this review, it looks pretty. The costume designs are nice. The CGI is lovely. The actual pting itself, as much as I pretty much love the bloody thing, it still looked good. It was certainly a nice CGI character. We got some rather unusual close-ups of it. It wasn't really left much to the imagination, unfortunately. Certainly, from this perspective, the main downfall of this episode is the actual script itself from Chibnall, and then that is then reflected within the actual characters, meaning that you've gone into this story with a bad script and you come out the other side with not really a very entertaining story, in my opinion. Some people may like this story, I fully respect that. If you do like this episode, why not leave it in the description below? Why do you like this? What was your highlight of the episode? What did this episode do for you? But for me, it just felt like one big disappointment. As I said, the two main benefits from this story is the fact that we now know that Graham has basically watched every single episode of Call the Midwife, and also that we know that he's had a bit of development now with Ryan, so that's good, isn't it? That's just what we can take for this story. It could have been done in 5 minutes, but hey, we just had 50 minutes of it instead. Prolonged pain, excellent. Just like that guy that gave birth to a child. For some reason. That is my review of Doctor Who Series 11 Episode 5, which is of course the Tsuranga Conundrum. I'm going to stop talking about it now, because I don't want to waste more of my breath on this story. Next week for the Doctor Who Series 11 reviews, we have a rather exciting story called Demons of the Punjab, which is written by Vinay Petal, which I can't wait for that story. It looks like a very interesting setting. We are in fact in 1947 partition India, which I don't think we've ever seen that in Doctor Who, so once again a very interesting setting, and looking forward to reviewing that one, because no doubt it's going to be a little bit better than this episode. In fact, because we are halfway through this series, I'm going to leave on the screen, either here or here, somewhere around the screen, I will leave my ranking of this series so far. It's quite predictable if you've seen the rest of the reviews, and it was very easy for me to do. I never normally do rankings, but I think that this series has a very clear, strong winner, a very clear, weak story in there as well. So yeah, generally, an interesting season, but I just hope it gets better, please. So that is that. Thank you for watching. I shall see you all next time. Bye for now.